Shalom. This is Ron Warren with the Nuggets of the Torah. This week's teaching is the 6th parsha of Deuteronomy and the 49th parsha of the Torah, and is called Tetze, when you go out. Question. When you explain a teaching to a person who believes in the Bible and yet gives an answer as, that's just your interpretation, how would you explain your answer? Unfortunately, that statement is used to say that there's no correct way of reading the text, or their view is just as good as ours. They will make this statement because they don't want to address it. It is because of their belief, and tradition says the opposite. This often abused phrase is not designed to aid the conversation, but to shut it down. Now, here's the problem. That is just your interpretation line says that there's no definitive or objective truth in the text's meaning. Absolute truth is truth all the time and in all places. It is something that is always true no matter what the circumstances, and it's a fact that cannot be changed. Now, we can confuse personal preference with absolute truth. I like dark chocolate, but not everybody likes it. That makes it true for me, but not others. That is a personal preference. Truth is also objective. My wife also likes dark chocolate. In that sense, it is objective. However, in the Bible, we don't have the option of saying that's true for you, but not for me. Why? To be God's follower implies you follow his ways and commands. And when we, as believers, are commanded by God through Yeshua and the apostles to do something, we have no choice. When we disobey, it makes us a non-follower of God. And here's something else. Beliefs do not always match reality. Gravity exists whether or not we think it. And this is true with a lot of other aspects of reality. But it's also true with Scripture. Scripture is not true or false, real or unreal, because we believe or don't believe. Having faith to believe something is true does not make it true. We establish truth in life through things that are or are not true. And we need good reasons to assess the truth of a claim. But the truth depends on reality, not upon our beliefs. Now, since truth is the truth, and I believe that Yeshua and the apostles spoke the truth, any deviation from that message is false. That forces us into hold a believing world view. Picture a seed. Now, picture that seed sprouting. Now, picture that seed growing to maturity and bearing fruit. That is the life cycle of evil. Evil is easier to deal with in the seed form than it is in the sprout form. Evil is easier to deal in the sprout form than in the mature form. But in whatever stage you find it, evil absolutely must be dealt with. And if we don't deal with the evil in our midst, he will. As mentioned in last week's parsha, there are 34 chapters in Deuteronomy. Chapters 12 to 26 cover many laws better known as instructions. These laws are instructions started in the parsha Re'ah. It continued through Shofim. It connects to this week's parsha of Tetze, and it's going to end with Ketavo. Now, consider this. The number 5 is the number for grace. Now, also consider this. The main theme of Moses in this week's parsha is, put away or purge the evil from among you. This is a reoccurring catchphrase, and it's repeated 5 verses scattered throughout this week's parsha. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 21, Moses uses the phrase with his instructions on dealing with a stubborn and rebellious son. In the same verse, Deuteronomy 22, verse 21, Moses again uses the phrase with his instructions on dealing with a young woman who does not preserve her virginity for marriage. In the next verse, Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22, Moses uses the phrase with his instructions on dealing with the situation of a man found having sexual relations with another man's wife. And in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 24, Moses uses this phrase with his instruction on dealing with a man found having consensual marriage or consensual relations with a betrothed or engaged girl. And in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 7, Moses uses this phrase with his instructions on dealing with one who kidnaps a fellow Hebrew and sells him as a slave for profit. You know, it carries over the idea of purging sin from the community of God as a principle that came from last week's Parsha, Shofim, which was also referred 5 times. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 7, Moses uses the phrase to explain why those who engage in idolatry should be put to death by the whole community. In Deuteronomy 17, verse 12, Moses uses the phrase to explain why any man showing contempt for a judge or a priest doing his duty must be put to death. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 13, next verse, Moses uses the phrase to explain why those found guilty of murder are to be handed over to the blood avenger to die. And in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 19, Moses uses the phrase to explain why anyone who gives false testimony concerning a brother is to have done to him whatever he was trying to do to his brother. And the last one is in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 9. Moses again uses the phrase to explain why the land where a man is found slain must be cleansed by the blood of a heifer. The point is this: in virtually every instance where sin is allowed to grow from seed form to full growth, its fruit is death. Therefore, it is the grace of God, the number 5, it is the grace of God to point out to us the sin in our lives while it's still in seed form, so that we can nip it in the bud. Shalom. Until next week's episode of the Nuggets of the Torah. And if this teaching has been a blessing to you, consider subscribing to this YouTube channel.